Hello friends and neighbors, I'm Matt Guy, and yes, I am wearing a Hufflepuff Quidditch Captain t-shirt, and today we continue to read Markus Zuzak's The Book Thief, and look at parts 1 and 2. The Book Thief is made up of 10 parts, and each part is named after one of the books that Liesl acquired in her lifetime. We're told that Liesl acquired a total of 14 books during the period in which this story takes place, but that 10 of them specifically factor into her development. 6 of these 10 books were stolen, including the first 2, the Gravedigger's Handbook for Part 1 and the Shoulder Shrug for Part 2. So let's start with Part 1, the Gravedigger's Handbook. One of the things I noticed about the first 2 parts is that the books that were stolen in them in some way paralleled Liesl's growing relationship with words. For the first few chapters after she steals it, the Gravedigger's Handbook isn't so much a book to Liesl as it is a keepsake, a reminder of her brother's death and her mother's leaving, because she doesn't know words yet, and so the words in it have no meaning to her. But the fact that she stole it from the graveyard where her brother was buried does have meaning to her, and so that's how she sees it. The focal point for Part 1 is pretty much the death of Liesl's brother, and how she not really gets past it, but at least makes her peace with it. And the Gravedigger's Handbook and Liesl's growing relationship with words is a major factor in how she does that. We start to see the beginnings of Liesl's relationship with words, and at first the words are just kind of there. They don't really have meaning yet. They're just kind of fed into Liesl. They are imbibed by her, if you will, without really having any meaning. She's just kind of collecting them at this point. Liesl is pretty much a child without words for the first few chapters of the book. She doesn't really say anything. She is still reeling with the shock of her brother's death. Her foster parents, Hans and Rosa Huberman, raised her in an environment of 2 types of words. Rosa's words are angry, borderline abusive. She calls Liesl Saumensch, which is a German word like many of the German words that I'm probably pronouncing incorrectly, and it translates roughly into filthy pig for a female. She swears a lot. She swears a lot at Liesl, she swears a lot at her husband, she swears a lot at the neighbors. She's just a woman who talks a lot, talks almost constantly, and every other word out of her mouth is pretty much a swear word. And so Liesl comes to imitate this. She comes to imitate the swearing and often the angry, judgmental words that come out of her foster mother's mouth. The second type of words that she grows up with are the words of her foster father, Hans Huberman, which are much more gentle and soft-spoken. Hans' words are reassuring. They're reassuring whenever Liesl has a nightmare about her brother's death, and he comes in and speaks to her saying that it'll be okay and that he's there. But at the same time, Hans can be pretty quick with the retort, especially when his wife is abusing him. And Liesl comes not only to imitate this as well, but Hans is the one who basically teaches her to read. And she learns to read with the keepsake of her brother's death, the Gravedigger's Handbook. And it's fitting that the first book that Liesl steals is basically a book about death, because death surrounds this story. It starts with the death, by all accounts it's going to end with death, and of course it's being narrated by death. But this seems to be a strange sort of comfort for Liesl. Learning to read the Gravedigger's Handbook is her way of coping with her brother's death. Facing this thing that is a constant reminder of this death is how she makes peace with it. And the choice of this book is arbitrary. It's just what happened to be lying around. So it doesn't really have any meaning on its own other than this is how she is going to learn how to read. And like I said before, the words that she is learning don't really have a lot of meaning yet other than here are some words. We'll string them together later, but here they are. Now that first reading lesson is significant to this story because this is the introduction of the third perspective telling the story. The first perspective, of course, is Death, the narrator, who knows everything and is telling us this story and has a definite personality of his own, as we talked about in the last video. The second perspective is Liesl, the Liesl that is existing in the story. Of course, she's the protagonist, and so we are seeing things from her point of view. And oftentimes the style of writing and the descriptions are very childlike in nature, but more on that later. The third perspective, however, is the older Liesl Meminger, the Liesl Meminger about 3 or 4 years later who is writing all of this down as she remembers it. Remember, this whole story comes from the fact that Death found this book that Liesel Memminger dropped at the sight of the third time that he saw her, and he is basically telling us the story from this book. But this is the first time that we actually hear about the Liesel who is remembering this, the Liesel that is actually in the physical act of writing this story. And it's happening at a significant part in Liesel's life, the part where she first finally learned how to read with her father. But it's the only time that we see this perspective in this part of the story. But it will be back. So the death of Liesel's brother pretty much saturates this entire section. It's the reason why anything in this section happens. It's the reason she stole the book, it's the reason that she had nightmares, it's the reason why Hans Huberman started coming in to comfort her at night, it's the reason why she started to learn how to read. And it's the reason why she foolishly volunteered to go up in front of the class and read because she thought she could do it. It's the reason why she failed, it's the reason why she got taunted, it's the reason why she subsequently beat up the boy that was taunting her, and it's the reason why she started to break down and cry after receiving a beating for said beating. It all stems back to the death of her brother. Also, just to reiterate again, Liesel doesn't have really much of a context for these words she's learning. She's just collecting them. There's a point in the story, in fact, when she is with her best friend Rudi Steiner, and they start to taunt an older man called Pfiffikus, another German word that I'm probably pronouncing incorrectly, called such because he whistles. It's not his actual name, it's just the name that he's been assigned. Rudi starts taunting him, and then, almost immediately afterwards, Liesel starts taunting him. She has no reason to. She doesn't know this guy. She doesn't know anything about him. She just knows that Rudi is taunting him, and so she starts to imitate him and taunt him as well. So at this point, she's just imitating the words that she is getting. She doesn't really know the true meaning of them yet, but she will learn. That's part one. Now let's move on to part two, the shoulder shrug. Both part one and part two start with the day of the book thievery, but where part one starts with the thievery and then we see the series of events afterwards, part two starts with the thievery and then we go back and see the series of events leading up to it. The title of part two is the shoulder shrug, but at this point we really don't know much about this book that Liesel has stolen because at the end of the section, she's only just stolen it. We really only know the title. We don't know what it's about, we don't know who wrote it, we don't know what kind of book it is. All we know is that it was a part of a Nazi book burning, so it probably contains material that is in some way objectionable to the Nazis. And also, it's on fire. So it's not the fact that it's called the shoulder shrug that's significant, it's the fact that the book is a book of fire. So what is this section about? This section is about Liesel basically coping with the disappearance of her mother. Liesel has finished reading the thing that was the reminder of her brother's death, and she has, in a sense, made peace with her brother's death. Now she moves on to her mother. So in this section, Liesel starts to learn about both the destructive power of words and the idea of words being destroyed or words being absent. As such, this section is a pretty dark one. This is a very dark part of Liesel's life, and it begins with Rosa Huberman losing one of her laundry customers. And the way that Rosa reacts is very significant here. Rosa Huberman, who is a woman of angry, swearing, and almost constant words, reacts with silence, reacts with the absence of words, which is an indicator of things to come. The words come later, of course, but in that moment, there are no words. This is also the section where Liesel learns of the fact that her mother is probably not coming back, and she learns this because she tries to write letters to her. She writes about 5 or 6 letters, she sends them out using money from her foster mother that she stole, and doesn't get a response, and pretty much figures out on her own that her mother's not coming back. This is another significant part of Liesel's life, and as such, we now see the second appearance of the third perspective, older Liesel, actually writing this section of the story. And this one's actually a little bit stronger because we actually cut away to a scene where we see 14-year-old Liesel Memminger writing this, and Hans Huberman, her foster father, actually talking about it with her. However, briefly, it's only like a couple of sentences, but it's there, it's an actual scene. So the portions with the older Liesel Memminger perspective are getting stronger, but it is still the only appearance of this perspective in this section of the novel. And in addition to the absence of words, the void of words, we also learn about the destructive power of words. We see this with Hans Huberman's relationship with his son, Hans Jr. They have a troubling relationship because Hans Jr. is a true and loyal Nazi, and Hans Huberman is decidedly not. And during one confrontation, Hans Jr. calls him a coward and walks out. So we have both the destructive power of words, the insult that he hurled at his father, and the absence of words as he leaves. Similarly, the word that Liesl knows describes her father, communist, now takes on true meaning here, or at least sort of true meaning. She still doesn't really know what it means, but she knows that the word communist is a hateful one for the Nazis, as hateful almost as the word Jew. Which leads us, of course, to the burning of the books and the bonfire. Here, of course, we have the literal destruction of words. We have words being burned right before Liesl's eyes. These words that she has come to cherish and to love. All of this, of course, leads to Liesl's conclusion that she hates the Führer. She hates Hitler. And more significantly, it leads her to stealing her second book out of the bonfire, A Survivor of the Fire. This book, which we know nothing about except, as I said earlier, the fact that it's in some way objectionable and the fact that it's still burning. So everything that happens in this section, everything that Liesl learns about the absence of words and the destruction of words, leads her to steal this book of fire that is a destructive force while at the same time it is being destroyed. And before I finish off this video, I do want to make a couple of remarks about the style of writing. Two significant aspects of Markus Zusak's writing in general, and in this book in particular, are the personification of inanimate objects and the mixing of senses, like saying that a voice sounds like cotton. As far as the personification of inanimate objects go, it's really compellingly used in this book to describe people that are not quite human. Whenever he's talking about Nazi soldiers marching, he doesn't describe them as the Nazi soldiers marching, he describes them as the uniforms marching with soldiers inside them. As if to say that it's the uniforms that have the personality, not the human being inside them. Similarly, when we're first introduced to the mayor's wife, she is introduced as a bathrobe answering the door with a person inside of it. This becomes more significant in part 2, where it actually says that she could not see the actual people in the distance, just the uniforms and the symbols of the swastika. And the last thing I want to talk about is the use of the German language in this book. Of course, the characters speak German, they are German, but for the most part, it is translated into English for the readers who don't understand German. But in part 1 at least, it isn't always. Most of the German is translated, even though it is spoken in German. We do see a translation a few sentences later in English, and in fact, when we're first introduced to Himmel Street, Death does make a point of telling us that Himmel means heaven. But they're not always, and even when they are, there is that momentary confusion where you don't understand the language. It's German. I don't speak German, so I don't understand what's being said. And this helps us to feel Liesl's confusion when people are speaking words that she doesn't understand. She doesn't have a real firm grasp on the language yet, and she doesn't know how to read, and there are words that she doesn't know. And so there are going to be moments when she doesn't understand what's being said. Much like we don't always understand what's being said. And this use of the German language occurs fewer times in part 2 than it does in part 1. So that's what I thought of parts 1 and 2. That's how those things struck me. If you have any other insights or observations to make, feel free to leave them in the comments or as a video response. And next week we will be looking at the very least at part 3 and possibly parts 3 and 4 and maybe even 5, depending on how much I'm able to read. And now if you'll excuse me, I have Quidditch practice.